It looks like a sea of skin and tattoos. These images, released by El Salvador's government, shows the transfer of about 2,000 inmates, stripped to their shorts and with their heads shaved, to what's been dubbed the country's new mega-prison. It just opened. It's believed to be the largest prison in the Americas, with a capacity for 40,000 people, and it's the latest step in a controversial crackdown on crime that's caused the country's prison population to soar.
So there's a video that's going viral recently coming out of El Salvador that was actually released by their government, which documented the transfer of 2,000 gang members into the new 40,000 capacity super prison that they built in that country. And we're going to talk about this video. We're going to talk about the reaction to this video, some of the dumbest takes that I've actually gotten in response to this, and we're going to give you the overall context of what's going on in El Salvador, because I think in order to understand why they've gotten to this point, you need to understand where they were just a few years ago, and that will help inform your decision on what's going on and whether or not you're going to be in favor of this. But before we get into that, this video is sponsored, so let me chuck it to the sponsor, then we'll bring it back over here and we'll discuss this whole thing on the other side. If you're concerned about your weight, you're not alone. A recent survey showed about half of all Americans are looking to lose weight, and one of the best things you could do for weight loss is go over to ketowithjustice.com and get yourself this amazing keto powder. I've talked about before about how members of my family are on the keto diet, and they swear by the powder over at Keto with Justice, which has 5 different key ingredients that helps jumpstart and prolong the ketosis process, and you can get this for yourself 51% off, 60-day money-back guarantee at ketowithjustice.com. That's ketowithjustice.com. What's the word? ketowithjustice.com. So the first thing that I want to point out from this video, and you can see it if you're actually watching it, and it's actually in the opening narration from the Reuters reporter who's talking about this, is the fact that these people are covered absolutely in tattoos. And these aren't just tramp stamps that you'd see on some random 20-year-old that she regrets 10 years later. These are gang tattoos. Everybody in this video, for the most part, is a member of a gang. Now, Reuters plays lip service to this argument that some innocent people have been caught up in this, but I do want to point out that this actually isn't evidence of the giant roundup that happened in El Salvador, which is actually separate from this. These are just hardcore inmates being transferred to a super prison that they built. Now, obviously, the fact that these inmates all have shaved heads, the fact that they're being transferred in shorts, has called for a lot of people to say, hey, that doesn't look good. I'm uncomfortable with the way that looks. But the thing is that if you have high security prisoners, this is typically how they're transferred. The only thing that's interesting about this is the large scale of the inmates that are being transferred. Now, what El Salvador is essentially doing is finally cracking down on the criminality in their country. And they're doing it in ways that I actually don't like, but I understand based on the context of their country. So first and foremost, let's get into the bad. So according to what Reuters is saying, they are incarcerating some people without legal representation. Now, in the United States of America, this is considered a fundamental legal right, and I don't believe that even in the most dire situations, this is appropriate to do. So this is where I would say, no, you gotta let these people have lawyers. You can detain them on suspicion with probable cause and all of that, but eventually I want them to go to a sensible legal proceeding.
Last year, the country's president asked Congress for emergency powers to temporarily suspend some constitutional rights after a massive spike in murders attributed to gang crime. It includes that arrests can be made without a warrant, and detainees no longer have a right to a lawyer. Private communications of all citizens can also be accessed by the government.
Now, the next thing that I need to bring up, and it's also brought up in this Reuters piece, is that apparently they're using, without warrants, and I'm not sure what the warrant system is in the nation of El Salvador, surveillance in order to tap the communications of all the private citizens in order to find these people. And I'm someone who believes in due process in gathering evidence, so I think, again, this would be beyond the line, and I understand that it's a current emergency order, forever, but the thing is that emergencies, even if they're told to be temporary in the beginning, tend to be permanent long term. So I think it's very important to point out that that is something that people are reporting is happening in the nation of El Salvador, and we shouldn't pretend that these violations of core civil liberties aren't happening. However, it is important to note that the way that the Salvadorian government has classified these gang members is as terrorists, and what they're essentially doing is a lot of procedures that unfortunately the United States of America did in the name of fighting against terrorism. But the thing is, or the difference between what's going on in El Salvador and what's going on in the United States of America, is that the threat of gang violence, the level of crime that is actually occurring, and the negative impact on El Salvador is actually far greater than any individual instance of terrorism or terrorism on American soil as a whole, and I'm going to explain that to you in great detail, because you need to understand the context before you just jump down the throats of the Salvadorian government. So, one of the things that is absolutely crazy is that El Salvador used to have the highest homicide rate in the Western Hemisphere, possibly in the world. I'm not exactly sure about that, but they were definitely in the tops. They had a homicide rate of 104 per 100,000 population. They had 6,600 homicides in the year 2015, and the El Salvadorian population is actually 6.4 million. So they are less than the population of the city of New York, but significantly, as in more than 10x times the amount of murders that the city of New York had. Now, after 2015, they ended up with 5,400 murders, somewhere thereabouts. But as you can see, this is a homicide rate that is absolutely insane, and even compared to the worst cities in the United States of America, is totally beyond that and on a level that people can't possibly fathom. Like, the numbers are so insane. In 2015, 0.1% of El Salvador's population was murdered. 0.1%. To give you some perspective on that, the United States population is 330 million. If we had the same level of homicide in a given year compared to El Salvador in 2015, we would have lost 330,000 people to murder. 330,000 people. That's what they're experiencing. That's the per capita rates that El Salvador is dealing with. That's insane. Now, one of the reasons why El Salvador was so bad was due to the fact that gangs were basically running the show. MS-13, who I'm sure you've heard President Orange Man, Evil Bad Orange Man, talk about in the past. I hope you haven't heard of them because they're in your neighborhood, because they're considered one of the more violent gangs in this country, was running roughshod over the country. There's also another gang. They have the number 18 in it. I forgot the name of them. I apologize for that at this moment. And these guys were not very good dudes, if I can say it in the most ridiculous, underselling the point kind of terms. But also, El Salvador had really soft on crime policies. When you live in a country that in a single year has 6,000 people murdered, and your total prison population is 36,000, you're not doing something right. I'm sorry, but no, the math really doesn't work on that. When you have 6,000 murders in a single year, 5,000 the year after, and around 5,000 thereabouts the year before, you shouldn't have 36,000 prisoners in your country. You should have far, far more. Obviously, El Salvador was dealing with an under-incarceration problem. The highest murder rate in the world, or among the highest in the world, definitely the highest in the Western Hemisphere, does not add up to 36,000 people in prison. Again, when you're experiencing 6,000 murders in a single year, something is totally misaligned. So one of the things that the new government did is start working on and building out a new prison that holds 40,000 people.
These images released by El Salvador's government shows the transfer of about 2,000 inmates, stripped to their shorts and with their heads shaved, to what's been dubbed the country's new mega prison. It just opened. It's believed to be the largest prison in the Americas, with a capacity for 40,000 people.
Which more than doubles the capacity for incarceration in the state of El Salvador. But the thing is, we're told by the left wing that incarceration doesn't work. Incarceration won't solve any of the problems. Incarceration is not the solution. In fact, I have some studies that show you that incarceration doesn't work in the United States of America, so how could you possibly think that incarceration would work in El Salvador? Obviously, it isn't. Obviously, we need to address the systemic systems and structural systemic whatever. So let's look at the crime statistics and see how much worse El Salvador has gotten. Now, this chart does not include the 2015 numbers, which is unfortunate. I found this other chart that gives you the per capita rate, so you could see it is higher in those years. But I do wish that this actually went back a little bit earlier. But as you can see, what we see in El Salvador is a precipitous drop in murders year over year. But one of the things that I found quite interesting is that in 2021, they had 1,140 murders. However, after the institution of these crazy policies that obviously won't work, because incarceration is definitely not the solution, the murder rate dropped by almost 58%, and now El Salvador has in and around 400 murders. Now, some people have pointed out, left-wing people in the United States of America, that 100 or so people were killed by the police, mostly gang members, and they try to add that in to say, well, actually, there's 600 murders because the police, all of those were murders, none of those were justified. Trust us, we're totally honest about police reporting, but even if you factor that in, you still end up in and around the 600 number, which is still a decline of nearly half of the year before. Now, I'm not including that because I don't buy into that nonsense, but even if you factor that in, obviously what you can see is that incarcerating people definitely works. Obviously it does, because the purpose of incarceration is to incapacitate criminals, remove them from society so they can't reoffend, so they can't keep offending in society. And guess what? That tends to drive down the homicide rate, and the numbers are undeniable. El Salvador went from one of the most dangerous places in the world to a place with a homicide rate that's honestly comparable and better than a lot of American cities.
Since then, about 64,000 suspects have been arrested. Murder reports fell about 57% last year.
Chicago has more murders than El Salvador, and they have a third of the population. Philadelphia has significantly less people, and they have more raw number of murders than El Salvador. Now, of course, there's been some backlash, specifically to my tweet highlighting this. Some people on the internet.com didn't quite like this, so they began throwing idiotic, buffoonish, and stupid arguments, and chief among the progenitors of those terrible arguments was TJ Kirk, aka the Amazing Atheist, who had these choice tweets for me and Adam Friended, who replied to my tweet, but whatever, we'll just get into what TJ said. You guys are effing disgusting. No human being deserved to be treated like this. And it's no wonder that a society that embraces this sort of violence on a state level has a crime problem. So TJ Kirk decided to step into the batter's box, hold his bat up, wait for the pitch. It was way outside, he swung anyway, then he flung his bat out of his hands into the stands and hit a small child. That's the level of intellect that he brought to the table with this tweet. El Salvador already had insane violence. They started instituting this. By the way, he's overreacting to a transfer of inmates, gangbanger inmates, some of the most violent people in the world, and then the homicide rate dropped dramatically. The violent crime rate dropped dramatically. El Salvador went from one of the worst places in the world, if not the worst place in the world, to better than many American cities. But according to TJ, because they securely transported these inmates to the super prison, then honestly, that state violence is definitely why we see the actual violence, even though the actual violence is dropping significantly. I don't understand what I'm saying. But of course, that wasn't it. TJ decided to follow it up by saying the following: the murder rate might go down in the short term, but if the conditions that lead to crime aren't dealt with, it will trend back up in a few years. Is it really easier to do a mass roundup of criminals every few years than it is to meet human needs? So one of the things that people try to do, and they do this a lot with crime when they're trying to sound intellectual, is they bring up root causes. Now, I have identified this as the root cause fallacy, which is this idea that the most efficient way or the smartest way to talk about or address any problem is to go after these so-called root causes. Now, TJ talks about meeting people's needs. Again, he's talking about arresting poverty in this situation. When TJ sees all these these tatted up gang members. He sees Aladdin. He thinks that they have a heart of gold. And if only they got their 3 wishes from the genie, they would prove to be great heroes of our story. But I don't buy into that because I'm not 4 years old. And obviously, this is not supported by the facts. El Salvador's GDP per capita is about $5,000. Now, you find me other countries that have a $5,000 GDP per capita that have the same homicide rate, the same level of violent crime, the same level of gang activity as the people of El Salvador have to suffer with. And then if that repeats over and over again, I would agree that maybe you have something about a root cause being poverty. But the thing is, what we see the world over is that nations with this GDP per capita, nations with similar median incomes, typically don't have this level of homicide because, again, El Salvador was among the worst in the world in terms of homicide because, again, poverty does not lead to crime. However, the crime in El Salvador led to mass emigration from the country, people fleeing the country, and actually drove down their economic growth because crime drives poverty. You need a rule of law in order to build up wealth, and we will see what the consequences of actually getting all these criminals off the streets actually is in El Salvador, and I'm willing to bet it's actually going to be positive for their country, because why would you want to invest in a nation when 1/10 of 1% of the population can be killed in any given year, and all people want to talk about is addressing the root causes of crime, meeting people's material needs. Again, if only we gave more breads like Aladdin to the other kids and we gave them genie wishes, crime would be solved, and it's just temporary that you're going to reduce homicides through these methods, and it's not really all that better to just round up criminals every few years and blah blah, leftism garbage. So first of all, to answer TJ's question, it is 100% way easier and way smarter to lock up criminals who are committing crimes repeatedly in your society, incapacitating them in order to drive down the crime rate, rather than try to do these abstract socialist policies to try to meet people's needs, whatever that means, even though there's no correlation between poverty or poverty at this level, or whatever you want to call it, and the level of violent crime experienced in El Salvador. In fact, El Salvador started electing left-wing governments in 2009 from their socialist party, or their more left-leaning party. I'm sure TJ will say they're not real socialists. And they tried instituting these policies, and guess what we saw during those 2 consecutive administrations? Insane spikes in violent crime and homicide when you had administrations focused on meeting the material needs of the El Salvadorians. But fundamentally, the problem with this whole root cause line of thinking is that even if you properly identify a good, solid root cause for the issue that you're dealing with, that does not necessarily mean that that is the most efficient way to address that issue. Like, for example, and this is the one that I gave on Twitter, it's not the one that I typically give in my videos. Let's say you're trying to deal with the consequences of earthquakes. Now, the root cause of earthquakes is the movement of tectonic plates. Now, if you are going to try to spend money, if you're going to try to spend $100 in order to deal with earthquakes, would you rather spend that $100 earthquake-proofing buildings, or would you rather spend that $100 trying to control the tectonic plates that have been moving since this planet was formed? Obviously, it's going to cost way more money, and you're going to have way less good results trying to control tectonic plates as you would trying to earthquake-proof buildings. So even though you're not addressing the so-called root cause, or in that case, the actual root cause, you're getting better results from addressing the problem at another point in the stream. Another example that I like to use on this channel is the way that we think about treating and dealing with HIV. Now, we could try to figure out if the CIA made HIV or cure it in the rhesus monkey, or we could deal with transmission, we can spend money on prevention, we can educate people on the use of condoms, we could develop things that prevent HIV from progressing into AIDS. None of these things are actually on the root cause side of things, but we have determined, even though we definitely want to cure HIV, and we definitely put some money into that, that addressing the symptoms, the more immediate concerns, is a more efficient way to deal with that problem rather than just hyper-focusing on the root cause. And again, You can do this with everything. Should we trace back and figure out the cause of every cancer? Sure, that would be great, but when somebody already has cancer, you need surgical methods, chemotherapy, and all these other treatments for what they're dealing with now, and going back to the root cause is not necessarily the best, the most efficient, or the most effective to deal with the issues that people face. On top of that, when you press people like TJ on root causes for crime in El Salvador, eventually they will get to the point where they'll say, you know what, Sean, the root cause, because, you always got to blame America, is the American drug war. If only we dealt with the American drug war, then El Salvador wouldn't have this huge crime problem. Now, even if I can see that point, let's say 100% for the sake of argument, the gangs, 100% American drug war and all of that, those people would be upstanding businessmen, they'd be stockbrokers, if not for the American drug war. How, if you're El Salvador, does that help you with anything? How, if you're the government of El Salvador, are you going to manage a functioning society if everything related to crime needs to be dealt with at the root cause level, which is the drug war initiated by another country? Obviously, that is not a solution. That doesn't do anything for El Salvadorians. That might make left-wingers in the United States feel more intellectual, but on the ground, they're experiencing thousands of murders every year, and this is the policy that cut that to under 500. The El Salvadorian policies actually do have problems, serious civil rights implications, and I think that they should be addressed. I hope that these emergency powers actually eventually get lifted, and these people do get access to lawyers, they do end up facing fair trials, and that we actually prosecute them in the right way, but keep them behind bars, because obviously these are dangerous individuals, but some among them could potentially be innocent. I'm guessing the ones that are covered from head to heel in tattoos would not likely be in the innocent category. I think the gang-affiliated tattoos might give some of that away, but obviously there could be some innocent people that are caught up in this big sweep, so I'm hoping that these powers are temporary and eventually we end up processing these people individually. But we need to understand the context of El Salvador, what they've had to deal with, the fact that they tried leftism for 10 straight years because they had 2 consecutive terms of their leftist policies and it did not work. It was a complete and utter failure. That's what brought us to the point where El Salvador was one of the most dangerous places in the world. And this response is due to the fact that these gang members were completely running the show in that country. And as for American leftists who think incarceration doesn't work because you have a study that says incarceration became less effective in the United States after the year 2000, no joke, this is something that was actually sent to me repeatedly on the internet, even though most of the prison population occurred during the 90s, and that's when we saw the crime drop, and saying that incarceration stops being effective after a certain point doesn't mean incarceration isn't effective. It just means that incarceration, like almost everything, has a marginal utility. And if that's the level that you're operating on, maybe you should take a step back, think about what you would do or what you would be in favor of if you were in a context like El Salvador. Again, the American equivalent would be 330,000 plus people murdered in a single year. And then make your judgments based on that. But hey, those are just my thoughts. And the thing is, you're free to disagree with me. Maybe you think the issue is poverty, and all the El Salvadorian authorities need to do is put out an APB for poverty, find out what poverty's wearing, plaster the description all over the internet so that they could arrest poverty, and that will be the solution. Or maybe you think that they should fight back against the American drug war because root causes. Or possibly you think they should address the systemic systems and structural systemic systems and their long history of slavery and evil white racism, because as we know in the United States of America, crime's root cause is definitely evil white racism, and there must be some evil white racists all over El Salvador being evil white and racist and doing evil white and racist things. Again, I leave those questions up to you. I tend to acknowledge the reality that root causes aren't any more important than any other kind of cause, and that you should address problems in the most efficient way possible. But again, I could be wrong. Let me know down in the comments below. If you like this video, show me by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on all my social medias, support me via the support links in the description box of this video. This has been me talking about El Salvador. Till next time.